All right, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michelle Crepeau, and I am the conservator for the North Carolina Maritime Museum. Thank you very much for joining us on this latest installment of the North Carolina Maritime Museum's um, Maritime Heritage Lecture Series. With this installment titled, I don't know why it's going by itself, This Collection Will Kill You, which is a discussion about the various hazardous materials you can actually find in museum collections. We're going to talk a little bit about what they are, why they're there, how you can identify them, and also what you can do about them. It's going to be kind of just sort of talking about kind of the greatest hits of all the hazardous materials. It is not going to be a thesis-length comprehensive dissertation by any mention, but it should be a good starter pack in terms of learning a little bit about the things in collections that we want to take notice of and be careful interacting with. This is my first time giving this presentation, so please excuse any hiccups that happen with the technology. We will get through them merrily as we can. So without further ado, let's begin. All right, I will give a little bit of a content warning. There are going to be a couple images that are a bit graphic of diseases and injury. They're going to be illustrated as well as a couple pictures, but I promise I tried to pick things that weren't super graphic and did not load up the presentation with just that by any stretch of the imagination. So, but just be warned, if you're a little squeamish, there might be a couple pictures of people's insides here and there. All right, so to begin, what is a hazardous material? So there's a lot of different definitions of what constitutes a hazardous materials depending on the authoritative body that you're asking. Our U.S. Department of Energy, which is the one that I consulted, describes a hazardous material as any solid, liquid, or gaseous material that is radioactive, toxic, explosive, flammable, corrosive, or otherwise physically or biologically threatening to health, which could cover a lot of things. And when we talk about hazards, we talk about it in various ways. There's certain different kind of caveats we want to talk about when we talk about defining what is a hazardous materials. First, it is to kind of consider who or what is being affected. This could be the individual. So we talk about risks to the individual. We also talk about risks in terms of the community or the population. And then we also talk about more systemic or environmental risk when it comes to hazardous materials and the impact these have. It's kind of a matter of scale, one person versus many people versus an entire ecosystem or city-wide environment, how that all relates to each other. We also talk about how people are affected in terms of the degree that they are affected, in terms of the magnitude of threat that these various materials pose. So we talk about this in terms of minor injuries, so minor injuries, minor illnesses, minor sort of inconveniences, things that you recover from fairly quickly, that heal up fairly quickly. We talk about there's also more permanent injury or chronic illness as a result of chronic exposure or massive exposure to these materials. And then, of course, there's also death. It's always a risk with some of these materials in the wrong circumstances. We also talk about how affected in terms of the magnitude of the exposure. So in terms of how much you are exposed to something or for how long. There's acute exposure, which are single exposure events, chronic, which is multiple exposure events over time, or cumulative effects that occur over time as well. Modes of exposure, there are many different modes of exposure, but some of the major ones include contact. So this basically means physical contact with the material that causes some sort of reaction. So this can be skin, eye, etc. Absorption, so kind of similar to contact. This is the absorption of the material into your body, directly into your bloodstream, usually through the skin or through a mucous membrane, like the nose or eyes, for instance. Inhalation, so breathing in material that is bad for you. Ingestion, basically eating or drinking or otherwise getting a material that is bad for you into your digestive system and getting it into your body that way. And also proximity. Some of our hazards are sort of just circumstances and being by something at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and sort of suffering the consequences. In terms of why do we have hazardous materials in my collections? Well, there's a lot of different reasons why we might have a material that is considered hazardous in our collection. Kind of the two categories are inherent, meaning that it is a kind of fundamental property of the material itself, and then there's also acquired hazards, things that it might pick up over time, either through its use life as it's being used, or as a result of being in proximity to something else. And this is, so basically the major reasons that we have toxic materials, we have hazardous materials in our collection is because sometimes they are the collection. They are part of an artifact's makeup, so they're a component of the collection, or sometimes they were a key component of the manufacture of that material, and there could still be traces of them left. And it also can be acquired through the use of that material with something else, or through sort of guilty by association accumulation from being in the same environment as something is hazardous and sort of picking up that material as it exists. And then also it sometimes acquires them because of attempts at preservation. That's a big one. As preservation treatments in the past have evolved over time, as we've tried to find more modern solutions to time-old problems like pest control, etc. So our first category that we're going to look at is poisons, toxins, and carcinogens, some of my favorites, and probably comprises the biggest category of hazards that you can find in the museum. So the first thing we're going to talk about are toxic metals, which you might also know more colloquially as heavy metals. Toxic metals is the more correct term for things like lead, mercury, and arsenic. Heavy metals is kind of meaningless in sort of an authoritative way in terms of any type of scientific body of organization. Heavy metal doesn't really mean anything. Toxic metals, however, does connote that these materials are hazardous to your health if you're in proximity to them or ingest them in various ways. So the effects of toxic metals can vary. And as we said, they are kind of contingent on things like age, your body weight, duration of exposure, amount that you're being exposed to at any given time. But essentially, they can come in a multitude of different effects, which can start as kind of simple as things like skin damage. So you might have contact dermatitis or rashes from contact with these materials, all the way up through increasingly worse and worse types of symptoms, kind of the worst being neurological damage. A lot of these heavy metal poisons are associated with long-term neurological damage and impairment over time. And of course, chronic exposure or heavy accumulations of these materials, particularly when it comes to things like lead and mercury, which actually can accumulate in your system and stay there for a very long time, can, in the worst case scenario, result in death. In terms of acceptable exposure limits, these have sort of varied throughout time and depending on the different regulating body that you're looking at. But generally, inorganic materials are going to be way more deadly than organic versions of the same thing. So we do have things like arsenic and mercury, which are incorporated into organic molecules that are sometimes part of our food. For instance, methyl mercury is actually the type of mercury that is found in tuna fish that is in our environment that gets passed up through the food chain. So that is a dietary organic form of mercury, but it actually has much higher tolerance levels than inorganic mercury, which can kill you a lot faster, I'll just say, in a lot smaller dosage. So arsenic, lead, and mercury. So as you can see, these are the various sort of recommended dosage exposures. Arsenic toxic effects can begin with as little as 5 milligrams of material, which is a very, very small amount. Fatal toxicity usually is generally between 100 and 300 milligrams of exposure. And generally the safe, I guess, sort of environmental contact with inorganic arsenic per day for OSHA is about 10 micrograms per meter squared. Oops, so I won't go into that. It's going to take too much time, so we'll go through that a little bit. So again, why are they in our collections? We've talked a little bit about why, in general, hazards are in our collections, but specifically, why are these toxic metals in our collections? Well, again, they are the collection because things like mineral collections exist. And arsenic, for instance, does exist as an arsenic ore. It comes in gray, yellow, and white arsenic. It also exists as orpiment and religar, are also common mineral forms of it that are very pretty that you also might find in your geology collection. Also things like arsenopyrite, so a type of pyrite which contains arsenic, which is a pretty common factor to a lot of mineral collections. Lead occurs naturally in the form of things like galena and caesarite, and then mercury occurs naturally as cinnabar, also known as mercury sulfide, which is a naturally occurring ore, and traditionally where most mercury is still today sort of mined and extracted from. So beyond just having a geology collection that has these materials as more or less themselves in them, We also have a long history of using lead, mercury, and arsenic medicinally. So if you are a pharmaceutical collection or have pharmacology materials in your collection, there's a good chance you will probably have something that is based on arsenic, mercury, or lead in your collection. They were used for very different reasons throughout time, but a lot of times they were used to some of those symptoms we talked about, especially the nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Sometimes people wanted to purposefully cause those symptoms in order to sort of purge your body, as it were, of ill humors. And in terms of traditional Galen medicine, so those were often administered to as a purgative. Of course, they would over time accumulate. There's a really famous history of treating syphilis, for example, and other sexually transmitted diseases with things like mercury, which in the short term did sometimes help mask symptoms, usually by causing things like peripheral nerve damage. But in the long term, the cumulative effects of that toxic mercury poisoning probably killed you faster than the actual disease you were trying to treat. And on top of the pharmaceuticals themselves, it actually pretty much up until the invention of penicillin in 1928, we were still using some of these medicines over the counter. Like arsenic, for example, was still being used to treat like amoebic dysentery up until the invention of penicillin, essentially. Even now, there are some forms of arsenic that are actually being used in cancer research that have very targeted uses for very specific types of leukemia. So they haven't completely gone away in terms of use medicinally, but we obviously understand a lot more about toxicity and about exposure limits and what is acceptable to use before it becomes more of a hazard than it is a benefit to your health. We also have artifacts that were used with these medicinal materials, going back to sort of those emetics. There's a variety of things like urethral syringes and clyster syringes that would have been used to essentially administer mercury enemas, more or less, or other types of mercury-based treatments. Often they have trace amounts of mercury. Usually it's not enough to be a problem, but it is kind of interesting to know that they're there. Other things, mortar pestles, containers that would have maybe contained these pharmaceuticals, they're all things that you should at the very least be aware of. They may have contained these materials, and just sort of be aware of that. And yeah, mercury chloride was essentially the form of mercury that was administered medicinally to treat syphilis, for example. Sort of a bit of a bonus content, sort of related to pharmaceuticals, is cosmetics. We also have a long history of using things like lead and mercury and arsenic in our cosmetics, as well as botanical poisons like belladonna. One of the more well-known is the use of white lead or lead white as essentially foundation. It helped to bleach or pale your complexion. This has been used for thousands of years. This is actually an example of a Roman little cassoulet that is filled with little discs of lead white that were then used to make a foundation material, essentially, that we would then apply to your skin. Also things like arsenic soaps that were being used to try to lighten your complexion or improve your complexion. The irony being that a lot of times exposure to these materials caused a lot more skin irritation and rashes, and of course, over time, accumulation of toxic metal toxicity over time, the more you use them. And that's just, ceruse is probably the most famous form of lead white. It was well liked because it adhered to the skin very well. It could be worn for a very long time without reapplication, so it was one of the reasons it was so popular. But it is derived from the mineral cerussite. Most famously, the form of it called Venetian ceruse, which was very popular during Tudor England, for example, was popular amongst Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I. And there's a lot of stories that talk about how her chronic use of Venetian ceruse might have actually contributed to her health failing as she got older, and sort of the need to keep and sort of ironically, in order to sort of cover up the increasing discoloration of your skin, the sores, and sort of the negative effects the makeup was having, is you would use more and more makeup to try to cover it up, but then you would also just expose yourself to more and more lead poisoning in this instance. And they were kind of interesting little side note, what they think made, because Venetian, all these materials, they used lead as a base, but they needed to be mixed in something else to help basically solubilize it or make it into more of a paste or foundation for the application. And how toxic these materials could be really kind of changed depending on what the recipe you were using for the makeup itself. And one of the reasons they think Queen Elizabeth makeup might have been so toxic is because she was actually using a solution based in vinegar. And one of the things that happens is that the vinegar is acidic, and acidity increases the absorption of our skin to absorb things like lead, because otherwise our lead is not really readily absorbed through contact. But when you use vinegar or other acids as sort of the base for your cosmetic recipe, it actually increases the ability of our skin to the solubility of lead and our ability to absorb it into our skin. So it also might have been her specific recipe that was giving her the types of outcomes that may not have been as noticeable in some other ladies of the time period. So it's just a little bonus. So going back to why are they in our collections? They're also part of an artifact's makeup. There's just a lot of uses for the lead, arsenic, and mercury are just in a lot of things. They've had a lot of different uses throughout time. For mercury, they're pretty instrumental even nowadays in things like barometers, thermometers, certain types of arc lamps still use mercury. Things like mercury amalgam, it was a good way to sort of basically stick things that didn't want to stick to other surfaces together by using mercury as an amalgam material, where basically you used it to coat things like the back of mirrors. Famously, we have leaded materials like pewter, and then leaded glazes and leaded glass as well. Most of these, again, how hazardous they were depended kind of on the stability of the glaze or the composition of the material. And obviously kind of, again, eating or drinking acidic foods or liquids was more likely to sort of kind of increase the intake of whatever you might be absorbing from these materials. But for the most part, pretty good to know they're there. Probably don't want to use them today. Definitely probably don't want to keep drinking like wine out of this goblet, for example. But for the most part, the amount of lead you were probably absorbing through or ingesting through these pathways was pretty low on a daily basis, but it was accumulative over the course of your life. So it might have contributed to some health problems we've had in the past. And then we also just have a lot of materials that are made of straight up lead, like these fishing weights, for example. And also we might have traces of how the artifact is manufactured. Most kind of famously is the felting process that happens with hats that are based in animal fur. So beaver hats, rabbit fur hats, they went through a felting process to give them that nice, smooth, glossy finish. And that felting process, or that sizing process also known, is what kind of led to erathiasm, also known as Mad Hatter's disease, which is famously associated with the milliner or hat making trade. And this because it was using mercury and nitrous oxide essentially as in a gaseous form to be able as a byproduct of this felting process. And just say that gaseous mercury is not something you really want to be exposed to. It will kill you a lot quicker, and it will also lead to a lot of the symptoms that are associated with sort of the Mad Hatter. So a lot of behavioral and neurological damage, a lot of behavioral and irregularity, emotional irregulation, that kind of thing we sort of associated with that. So just a little fun tidbit that the character from Alice in Wonderland was actually based in sort of a real phenomenon with all these sort of health problems that were tied specifically to the hat making trade because of the use of mercury compounds in the felting and sizing process. And this process, this continued pretty much into the 19th century, into the 20th century as well, before we kind of finally started discontinuing it. All right, and so part of an artifact's makeup or manufacture, sort of the biggest category that we really encounter in a museum context that we are actually worried about, because I said a lot of the other types of objects, they're pretty contained, they're in something, they're either bound in the matrix of the structure of the artifact itself, or they're contained in a glass container within the artifact that's useful for how it runs, but otherwise you're pretty distant from it for the most part, unless you're actively using it. However, toxic pigments, dyes, and paints are a little bit another story. So throughout time, we've used mineral pigments essentially for various things. There's the arsenic sulfides, which famously are some of our oldest arsenic-based pigments that produces this really nice yellow and this really nice kind of red color with frelga and orpiment. There's the copper arsenites, which we'll talk about in a little while, which is a famously green color. There's also lead-based materials such as chrome yellow and white lead, as we've talked, also minimum or red lead, which is derived from white lead. And then there's also vermilion, the color vermilion, which is from cinnabar or from mercury sulfide once again. So these are where these pigments have come from. into sort of my favorite one is the most deadly one, which are the copper arsenates, also known as killer greens, as it were. All right, so throughout time, we've always loved the color green. However, it's a color that is fantastically hard to replicate sort of synthetically, especially when it comes to dyeing things, dyeing our clothing, dyeing our cloth. We love green, but it's really hard to actually achieve a good, solid, stable green. Traditionally, you would have to do it by either labeling, like basically layering yellow dyes or blue dyes on top of each other until you got a shade of green that you liked. But this is obviously time-consuming, resource-consuming, and also a lot of times the natural pigment dyes that were being used were not super color fast. They would often fade over time, or they were effulgent. They'd be rinsed out over time through multiple washings, etc. There's also the mineral pigments, so things like malachite, azurite, and basic copper coprinates, which are mineral pigments, which are very useful when it comes to painting and other painting and coloring glass, other types of processes like that. But when it comes to dyeing, they don't really, they are not well retained in the fabric very well. They tend to be very water soluble, they tend to wash out really easily, and they don't produce the kind of vibrant green colors that we see in nature. So it took a really long time for us to synthetically reproduce a green that we enjoyed, essentially, that was more stable than these and also that was kind of a nice, rich green. The first version of an artificial green dye was Scheele's green, or Schloss green, which was invented in 1775 by our friend Carl Wilhelm Scheele. It is this kind of yellowy green. It is copper arsenite is the basis for that. This was later, and this continued to be popular for pretty much up and through the 1860s. Improving upon Scheele's method, there was also what was called Paris green, also called emerald green, that was produced in 1814 through the William Dye and White Lead Company, which is copper acetoarsenite. And it produced this really vibrant, bright emerald green, this really jewel tone that people were just obsessed with. Like, they put these two colors in everything. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. They used it to manufacture wallpaper, paper for hat boxes. They covered everything with it. They used it in paints, artist pigments, but also just like house paints, paints to just paint objects with. They used it in their clothes, which is where you kind of get this line of arsenic green dresses from. They used it in children's toys. Not a great call. What do children do with toys? They put them in their mouths. They put them in, they're in book bindings. There's a whole kind of fun collection through the Winterthur, Delaware University and the Winterthur collection that's all about arsenic books. They were in fake flowers. And they were also disturbingly, which I find the most disturbingly enough, they were also used as a food coloring. Everything from marchpan to Mont Blanc. So they were repeated throughout the 1800s. There were repeated stories of horrific poisonings happening at dinner parties because people decided to put that nice green dye into your nice dessert. And then people became very sick. And sometimes they would take little sugar treats home to their children from these parties and give them to their children. And then their children would get sick and often die. Children disproportionately die as a result of arsenic poisoning, which I kind of wonder why. But just to kind of, I don't think it's too much to say that Victorian times were very much kind of made of arsenic. It was in your food, it was in your clothing, it was in your water, it was in your house. You were constantly exposed to arsenic. In fact, you were so exposed that the Punch magazine out of Britain actually had a running series of essentially satirical magazine spreads and cartoons about it. Arsenic is one of those things where it was well known how deleterious it was for your health. It actually was obviously used as a household poison, but people just kept using it. And in terms of the fashion, but sorry, lost my train of thought, apologies. There's one anecdote that's kind of interesting, and then a doctor walked up to a nice society lady at a party one day, looked at her dress and examined it and determined that there was as much as 60 grains of arsenic per square inch in her dress, which is enough to kill at least a dozen people. So you can imagine being in contact with that every day, all day. Of course, the people that tend to bear the brunt of most arsenic poisonings, however, weren't the consumer general public. It was also the people that were manufacturing these goods. It was the seamstresses and the dyers that were working in these increasingly industrialized institutions that were tearing the fabric, ripping the fabric, spreading arsenic into the air and then inhaling it. It was the people that was, as our hatters were, breathing in toxic fumes from the production of materials that were using arsenic and mercury. And then there were also outbreaks where we also had some instances of mass poisoning events, for instance. There's a really famous one that happened in 1858, where essentially arsenic was accidentally added as an additive into a batch of sugar, because for a very, very long period of time, it was very common practice to try to essentially adulterate your flour, your sugar, try to make it go further by adding non-edible things into it, including things like plaster. Except what happened in 1858 was that there was an unfortunate mix-up where instead of putting plaster into your flour or your sugar, you accidentally put arsenic, and ended up basically making at least 200 people very ill and killing at least 21 people in the process. It was actually this particular incident that led to the first actual regulations against the adulteration of food in 1860. So there was some good happening as the kind of public consciousness was starting to turn the tide in terms of having so much arsenic in everything. And it is in the 1860s, and it is in the late 1850s, around that same time, 1856, that we have the rise of the aniline dyes. They were actually invented by a man named Sir William Henry Perkins as an 18-year-old. He was a chemist. He was actually trying to make synthetic quinine, and in the process, out of coal tar, produced a line of aniline dyes and produced what is known as mauvine, so the first sort of mauve-colored purple pigment dye. Also, other processes based on coal tars were things like fuchsine, and they introduced a new range of bright, vibrant purples and pinks and electric magentas, and things that the later Victorians were just wild for. So it was this kind of combination of circumstances kind of made between the growing public awareness of what arsenic could do to you and just how much it was in everything, and also the beginning, especially in the 1860s, the sort of mass production of these alternative colors that were still kind of replicated these vibrant jewel tones that people desired, but were less hazardous. Eventually, things like Paris green and Scheele's green thankfully started going the way of the dodo in terms of being used in a lot of as a commercial dye and pigment. However, where Paris green did persist was as a pesticide in agriculture. Paris green was used pretty much up through the 1930s in the United States, for instance, as a agricultural pesticide. It was then supplanted by copper arsenates, which started to then be phased out in the 1970s, thankfully. But copper arsenates have been with us for a very long time, and just their sheer amount of prevalence for over 100 years in just everyday items ensures that those items will end up in the collection just by sheer volume. So to kind of answer the question, and also kind of jumping off the idea of arsenic being used as a preservative or pesticide, the other major reason you will find these materials in our collections is their use as biocides. So traditionally, things like Paris green, other copper, copper lead compounds, mercurial chloride, for instance, these were all, they do a good job killing people. We know that. They also do a good job killing other things. So we tend to use them quite liberally as preservatives to try to protect material that is sensitive to being eaten by pests, fungus, and other types of biological life. So this includes things that are in our animal and botanical specimens. So definitely if you have a botany collection, if you have an animal specimen or skin collection, especially one that has a lot of taxidermy in it that predates basically the 1980s, there is a high chance that you will have some form of toxic metal in that material that was spread deliberately as a preservative, as a pesticide. Also, anything that is made of animal skins or pelts, leather, any type of organic sort of fiber like wool or silk, so these protein-based materials, things that have feathers in them. These are all things that often made their way into things like costumes, accessories, gloves, hats, and also what we used to call like ethnographic collections, but is now more sort of appropriately termed indigenous collections, or collections in which cultures use a lot more organic materials, a lot more feathers, skins, etc., for everyday objects. So these were kind of high targets of pest attack, and ergo they were high targets for trying to prevent pest attack through the use of toxic metal pesticides. All right, so how do I figure out if they're in my collection? Number one, and this is going to be true throughout the entire presentation, you'll get really sick of me saying it, but context. Context is going to be your number one clue to help you determine whether or not your collections most likely have some type of toxic metal component to them. This is considering when was your artifact made, what time period, were arsenates, were lead, were mercury heavily in use during that time period as a common pesticide. Also, where did it come from? Did it also come from a country where we still use those types of pesticides or use them a lot longer? So it all kind of comes down to context and sort of knowing the biography of your object to be able to determine the things that most likely was in contact with throughout its life. Also kind of to sort of know information about hats were often made using mercury, so there might be residual mercury still on these hats, that kind of information. And this example is that most taxidermy up through the 1980s probably has arsenic on it. And even then, anything up until basically 1983 is pretty suspect. So just when in doubt, just kind of assume that if you have a taxidermy specimen that was made pre-1983, there is most likely has some form of toxic metal pesticide that had been applied to it. Also, you can also conduct a visual inspection, often along things like animal skins, for example. You can sometimes find this white particulate matter that is deposited sort of around the orifices, so it tends to collect the nose, the mouth, the eyes, the ears, and sometimes around the seams as well. However, visual analysis is often not enough to 100% conclude that you have a heavy toxic metal material, because sometimes it can also be sodium borate, which is borax, which is also a much less toxic form of pest control for things like ants, etc. It's kind of up there with using diatomaceous earth. So just because you see white powder on a taxidermy specimen or another item that is pre-1893 that 1983 that you suspect might have arsenic or something else on it, doesn't necessarily mean it is. In which case, sometimes you might perform a chemical test. Nowadays, you can find that is the wrong button. You can find pretty available field test kits over the counter, things that will essentially you would use to test your water for arsenic or lead or mercury content. A lot of times there are ways to apply them to test for arsenic or lead or mercury in your collection as well. You can also do mail-in testing. There are companies that essentially you send them a sample and they will test it for you and then send the result back. And then you can also directly hire a lab to come test your collection as well. And something that museums often rely on is a type of spectral analysis called PXRF, which stands for Portable X-ray Fluorescence. And how it works is that it uses X-ray energy. So X-ray is a type of electromagnetic energy that we can harness to do things like make X-ray images. So same material. In this case, we are harnessing it to tell us information about the composition of a type of artifact. So in this setup, we have our X-ray source, which is our PXRF. We also have our sample, and then we have the detector, which is also the PXRF, which will basically, and what the output they're looking at is that they are looking at what happens when you essentially fire X-ray electromagnetic energy at the electrons in the atomic, basically at the atomic level. They're looking at what happens when you fire electromagnetic energy at an object on the molecular level. And essentially what happens is that energy excites electrons in lower valences into higher valences or higher orbitals of higher energy, and also causes the replacement of those. Basically, it causes a mass sort of shift of where that energy is, where you have excitations of electrons up, and then you have other electrons that are moving to sort of take their place at lower valences as well. So you end up getting kind of this almost sort of wave formation. And what happens is that it creates visually, what happens is it creates this output, this spectra, these peaks, which represent basically, and each of these peaks is, I should say, are distinct to each different type of atomic element essentially has a distinct peak at which it essentially fluoresces at which that excitation happens. So which creates these peaks, which we measure in kilovoltage. And these counts basically give you a semi-quantitative method of saying how much of that material is present in the area that you're looking at. So this kind of gives us a semi-qualitative idea of talking about elemental composition of various artifacts. So this can basically help tell us, is there elemental arsenic present? Is there elemental lead present? Is there elemental mercury present, etc.? This is actually an example from our own collection. This is an object collection that is actually currently on display up in Hatteras. You can go up to the graveyard at the museum. Graveyard at the Atlantic Museum, you will see this on display in the Civil War, in the War of 1812 and Civil War section. What it is, it's a naval officer's chapeau bras, which is this kind of fancy looking hat, the hat box that it came in, and as well as the stand that it was sitting on as well. And as you can see, when I first saw this, I was a little concerned. So there's the hat box, and then there's the stand. And as I said, once you look at this, you can kind of see that I was a little concerned because that is a rather concerning shade of green. So I thought the best way to deal with it was by getting my friends at the OSA lab to come up with their PXRF and actually analyze the material so we can confirm whether or not this is a copper arsenate-based pigment in this box. That would help us inform what we should do in terms of handling it. It would definitely at least what cautions we needed to take to be able to safely interact and exhibit this artifact, essentially. And this is the spectra that came back from the hat box itself. So just the raw spectra right here. And these are two reference spectra. This one's for arsenic, this one's for lead. These two often overlap, so sometimes they can get confused. But as you can see, there's a pretty distinct arsenic peak right here. There's also a copper peak right here following behind it. So this was a good confirmation that, yes, this was definitely a copper arsenite, most likely probably Shields green or Paris green. Come back to haunt us. So these things do turn up in our collections, and you can actually go see this lovely, vibrant, this image really doesn't give you a sense of how vibrantly neon green this box is. So I do recommend that when you get a chance to go up to the Outer Banks, that you go visit in the Graveyard at the Atlantic Museum and see for yourself just kind of what that looks like, even after all this time. We also XRF the hat because, again, this is a hat from mid-19th century. It's felted beaver fur. It has a beaver fur lining. So we're kind of like, okay, so it's a felted hat from the right time period. There's beaver fur inside of it. Odds are that it was probably made with mercury and also probably contained some sort of heavy, toxic metal pesticide or treatment that was applied to it at some point during its life to help protect it and preserve it. And sure enough, we found elements of iron, probably from contact with the stand. We found copper and arsenic, so that definitely kind of denotes that there's probably some sort of copper arsenate at work as well as a pesticide, probably. And there's also substantial levels of mercury as well. So that also indicates this hat was probably used using mercury nitro peroxide. So yeah, so the iron probably came from the wire. The copper and arsenic probably is either transferred from the hat box or was part of a pesticide that was applied to it, perhaps even Paris green itself. And mercury was from the felting process, or might have also been used as a pesticide treatment as well in the form of mercuric chloride. And then we also got this kind of interesting bromine peak. Bromide was also another type of now kind of defunct toxic pesticide that we sometimes find in museums. However, it can be kind of a little misleading because bromine is also a natural byproduct of the decay of organic material as well. So it could just be part of the degradation of the hat over time as well. But still kind of interesting information to know about this object. And we also took, just to kind of confirm that this wasn't sort of a one-off, we also took samples here from underneath the hat in the lining, as well as various points on the hat as well. And they all came out with very similar results. So we're pretty confident that this hat has been treated with some sort of arsenite compound in the past and was probably manufactured using mercury. All right, so we know that we have these materials in our collection, so what do we do about them? Well, unfortunately, there really isn't a complete or fully effective or efficient way to remove toxic metals from most materials. Basically, without destroying the artifact, it's very hard to remove a lot of these materials. They're not often very water soluble, and oftentimes the process of trying to remove them creates more issues in terms of creating the type of dust that you can then inhale and actually cause ingestion and inhalation of the material itself. Again, so main modes of exposure, ingestion and inhalation, in a lot of ways that kind of fully or partially even deal with these would involve increasing the risk of ingestion or inhalation during the process. Again, it is most hazardous during manufacture, but that doesn't mean that we can't, as these materials start to decay and fall apart, doesn't mean that that toxic material doesn't become basically abundant in the environment as a result. So basically what we recommend is to reduce handling. So basically minimize your contact with the object, reduce, trying to disturb the object and potentially like kind of shaking things loose and kind of creating particulate clouds of potentially toxic materials, and also kind of reducing transfer to your skin, which you can then accidentally transfer to other parts of your body, like your mouth or your eyes. A big step in this is to wear your personal protective equipment or your PPE, so things like nitrile gloves, N95 masks or respirators. Also, it's a reminder to appropriately label and dispose of your contaminated PPE in accordance with your local and state guidelines. Send masks. Practice good hygiene. So if you do have contact with these artifacts, regardless if you think your skin has touched them at all, it is good practice to wash all exposed skin, hands, and also your clothing. Also part of PPE, a lot of times people wear lab coats or even sort of Tyvek coats over their normal clothes while they're working with the material to try to protect those. Those are easily laundered and easily disposed of. If you do decide to clean something like a taxidermy material that has arsenic or another type of toxic metal on it, use a conservation grade vacuum that has a HEPA filter on it, and always use it on the lowest setting possible, so that you're not disturbing the material that's on the surface and sort of kicking up potentially hazardous materials into the air and then breathing it in. And also remember to appropriately dispose of any contents after you've essentially vacuumed up or dusted your collection as well. Dispose of that. Also, documentation is key. Please document what materials you suspect of contamination or have confirmed are contaminated. Make sure that these are reflected in any conservation ports, accession records, labels, so that people know that these items are potentially hazardous and they know to approach with care. And then lastly, please don't lick the artifacts. Like #1 rule in museum world, please don't lick anything. Don't ingest things. Other things you can do is you can help the delay of the decay of these materials and thus delay sort of the release of these potentially hazard materials into the environment, where you can then inhale them, ingest them, they can settle on other things, they can travel, etc. So this includes maintaining a good storage environment or display environments that slow degradation, so doing things essentially like controlling RH, which is key in terms of chemical degradation, controlling pH, for example, because we know things like lead become more soluble and more likely to be absorbed by organic matter like ourselves in either really acidic conditions or really basic conditions. Oops, I guess. All right. So we also have one of the major issues we have in a lot of not just museums, but in buildings in general in the United States is contending with lead paint. So often with lead paint, the thing you would like to do is completely sort of remediate it by removing it entirely, but this is not always possible, especially if it's a collection item in which the lead paint is, part of the fire to the artifact, it's part of its history, it's part of its story. We want to retain that, conserve it as part of the object. In which case, we might have to come up with some other type of methodology to try to contain the lead paint as it starts to deteriorate and fall apart, to prevent it from being basically particularized and getting into the air where we can breathe it in, or people can accidentally pick it up on themselves and ingest it through contact. So this includes things like adding a consolidant. So a lot of times we will put something like an acrylic resin to use to consolidate a paint letter to hold it in place, to make everything as intact, to make sure we don't lose any of that lead into the environment by accident. Sometimes you might use a support material, so something like a very thin crepeline or other type of cloth to sort of add some sort of structural integrity to the material so that it is not falling apart, as well as adding a barrier between it and things that might abrade it or bump into it or sort of accelerate the deterioration, loss of paint, and it's sort of turning into smaller fragments, then become aerosolized. Also can encase, like covering it or encasing it can help in a support material, can also help sort of catch any materials that it kind of create a nice little bag or envelope for any materials that do fall off to kind of accumulate in that you can then much more easily get rid of if need be. And the last issue is to encapsulate, to fully encase it with something like a paint. And we actually have a good example of this from the Maritime Museum. Anyone who's been there has noticed this anchor out in our parking lot. This painting was originally applied with lead paint. That lead paint, out of being in the elements for many years, was starting to deteriorate. And the decision was made that it was not really practical to fully remediate it by removing the lead paint, as even though it's in a nice ventilated area, it is also outside in the environment, and we were not confident we would be able to basically contain the lead paint once we started stripping it, and basically was just creating kind of more of a cleanup nightmare and potentially an environmental hazard on top of everything. So we went with the route of encapsulating it in a different type, in basically a paint that was made to encapsulate like other types of lead paint as a remediation, and basically trap it and separate it from the environment. So basically, all these methods come down to minimizing contact and exposure is kind of the best thing to do when interacting with artifacts that have arsenic, mercury, or lead components to them. And then worst comes to worst, there's also disposal as an option. There's many steps that go into deciding whether or not it is appropriate to dispose of an artifact because it has in part or because it has some sort of the toxic metal toxicity that is associated with it. A good example of this is that a few years ago, we actually just completed this last year. We had a collection of 43 bird mounts, so basically taxidermied bird mounts in our collection that we XRF'd using our friends at the OSA lab, and they were able to determine that we had arsenic contamination. So it was both and it was an interesting situation because it was specimens that had both obviously been treated with arsenic themselves, and then examples of mounts that had been contaminated by arsenic by just being in close proximity to the arsenic treated birds. So we ended up having 43 birds out of the entire specimen collection that were considered having an unacceptable arsenic content. So the conclusion was made to dispose of these birds. In part, this decision was made because it was a large collection, and because it was so large, we had very limited sort of safe long-term storage opportunities for it where we could safely kind of segregate it from everything else. And also the fact that it was spreading, like the arsenic was getting on other things, was something that we considered in our decision-making. And also the content of the collection, we deaccessioned it before we actually disposed of it, because also considered that the sort of content, the bird mounts, was no longer part of our collection mission at the Maritime Museum. So the decision was made to appropriately dispose of these using a licensed disposal company for hazardous materials. All right, moving on, asbestos. All right, how are we doing time? All right, we are running very long, I apologize. Asbestos. So asbestos is an interesting material. It is a naturally occurring silicate material that's composed of fibrous crystals. And we actually have records of humans using asbestos. We think of this as very kind of more of a modern material, but we have records of people using it as far back as the Neolithic. They were using it as basically fill in ceramics. We even have some evidence of them using some basically as fire retardant fabric, maybe in some areas of Finland. But it wasn't until the 19th, so this is something that has always been around, that we've always kind of known about, but it wasn't really till the 19th century that large-scale mining operations really kind of took a hold, and asbestos just started becoming kind of a part of everything, as it were, because it ended up being, because it was valued for its properties of being a very good thermoelectrical insulator and also a very good fireproofing material. All right, and so asbestos, as you can see kind of more on this zoomed in, is those fibers I was talking about are themselves made of smaller fibrils that often have a habit of shattering and breaking away from larger fiber when they are abraded. And these materials can then, unfortunately, can be inhaled and then embed into the lungs, as we see in this X-ray. And this can cause long-term issues like scarring of your lung tissue. It can cause the creation of these plaques that form, so basically almost like keloid formation of scar tissue in your lungs, as well as these interesting things called ferruginous body formation, which are basically fibrils that are then coated in essentially hemoglobin. It's basically it's iron from your blood that essentially anneals to them and creates these kind of interesting bodies, which are very indicative. And this condition is known as asbestosis. This condition results in chronic inflammation of the lungs, which can then result in turn in difficulty breathing and also higher risk of recurring lung infection. And it also increases your chances of developing cancer, specifically mesothelioma, as well as pulmonary heart disease. So not great. So why are these things in our collection? Well, again, it is a correction because it is a natural occurring mineral. There are 6 recognized types of naturally occurring asbestos. The most common is cryostyle. This is the one that is used most commercially historically. The thing is, like, people have known that this is a toxic material for a while. It was first recognized as toxic in the late 19th century. The first attributed death that was associated directly with asbestos toxicity was in 1906. The first diagnosis of asbestosis was in 1924. The first mesothelioma specifically started being associated with it in the 1940s. But even so, it didn't gain wide recognition as a toxic material until the 1970s. And even then, it still wasn't fully phased out of things like construction material until 1989. And it was only in 2003 that it was officially banned in the United States. So we've known about the health implications. We've been using it for centuries. We've known about the health implications for at least a century. But it's taken us a while to finally kind of divest ourselves of asbestos. It is in our collection because it houses your collection. Because a lot of times buildings, again, that were built basically before the 90s have asbestos in them, including museums, including ours. It's in drywall, it's in insulation board, it's in roof sheeting, it's in siding, it's in plaster cement siding, and it's in plaster, it's in cement siding, and it's also oftentimes in tile and flooring. I actually have a wee little bit of this in a closet in my lab. So just to emphasize that. It is also part of your artifacts in many instances. For instance, these cute little booties are actually made out of asbestos fiber. So this is an example of fabric made of asbestos. Also, it's used as an insulator in liners and ceramics, oven mitts, irons. It was used notoriously as parts in the part of the filtration system in gas masks beginning in World War I up through World War II. One of the weirdest things that I found was asbestos pipes. Smoke it. Sounds great. And this became, asbestos really kind of became more prominent in discussions about hazards in museum collections, starting in, basically 2014 when people were, and before then when people were preparing for the 100th anniversary of the First World War, because they were starting to find asbestos in so many World War I related items, most particularly the Brodie helmets where they're being used as linings, but again, also in gas masks. I have not encountered these myself in our collections, but I know the Museum of History, which had a very well-received, big memorial exhibition dedicated to World War I. I know the conservator there was having to contend with what to do with when he found unexpected asbestos in your artifacts. All right, how to tell in my collection. Again, context is important. Were these manufactured during a time period where asbestos was commonly used in these types of items? Were these produced versus were they produced after a time period where we had phased it out? Visual inspection, you might be able to suspect that something has asbestos by visual inspection, but you really need to kind of look at it at a microscopic level to really kind of be able to determine that. Especially useful are things like polarized light microscopy or scanning electron microscopy for really being able to identify that material. Testing, unfortunately, there are no do-it-yourself kits. This is not something that has made it to the general public as something that is safe to do. So essentially, they do have mail-in kits, so you can take samples and mail them to labs, which will test it for you. You can also hire an expert who will come in and do an assessment on site as well and might take samples to confirm as well. Again, another thing that is not necessarily efficient or desirable way to mitigate it in a way that doesn't necessarily destroy the integrity or character of your artifact. It also, if it's a building remediation, again, it could be a wide-scale renovation project that could result in the closure of your museum for extended periods of time. It's money, it's resources. It also, puts it out there that you are then disturbing this material and therefore sort of putting it into the air and probably making it more likely that you will breathe it in. Again, main mode of exposure is inhalation. Basically, the best thing to do is, once again, reduce handling, minimize your disturbance, especially things that might abrade this material, create those little fibrils that get into the air and then into your lungs. Always wear your appropriate PPE, and always, choose least invasive cleaning materials when you are dealing with materials that have asbestos in them. And then one thing that's the solution that the Museum of History, for instance, came up when they were having to deal with these sort of hat linings that had asbestos in them, was to eventually line them or encapsulate them in a Crepeau material to essentially add support, stop them from falling apart, but also to help sort of contain the material that was underneath them. Again, document and label everything. Cannot stress that enough. And generally speaking, much like all the other toxic materials we have talked about, minimizing contact and exposure is probably your best recourse in terms of dealing with these materials, if you want to keep them in your collection. All right, so a little bonus, we're going to talk about radiation poisoning and radioactive materials. So basically, essentially, since it was discovered in 1898 by Marie Curie and extracted from uranium ore, people have been gaga about radium. Like the very first couple decades of the early 20th century, radium was in so much stuff. It was in cosmetics. It was in toothpaste. They had radium water, which was sold as a house tonic. How much actual radium were in any of these materials is kind of a crapshoot. But the fact is, there was radium being put into commercially available products that you were supposed to put in your body or put on your skin, essentially. It was people are fascinated with the fluorescence and sort of the illumination it gave you, that radium glow, as they said. Probably most famously, that was used in this type of pigment called undark, which was essentially a glow-in-the-dark pigment. So before we were able to synthesize glow-in-the-dark pigments, we used radium. And I mean, we use this livery. People use it as face paint. They painted their lips with it. They painted their eyelashes with it. They were very, very liberal with putting this paint on any surface they could come into contact with, including themselves. In terms of manufacture, it was most commonly used in dials. So watch dials, military instrument dials, things that might be helpful that you could see glowing in the dark when you were trying to figure out where the time was, where your position was, etc. Now, in terms of uranium, radium is often found in conjunction with uranium in uranium ore. So while they were trying to extract the radium during this big radium craze, they had all this leftover uranium. And one of the things they did with all this leftover uranium was actually use it as a glaze in glass and ceramics. So then we kind of get this phenomenon of uranium glass. Now, uranium as a component in glass goes back as far back as the Romans. So we do know that people have been doing this for centuries, but it hit a kind of a peak height in the early 20th century, especially here in the United States, where we have this very vibrant, very cool uranium glass. I will say that even though it looks frightening, and it's obviously probably one of the most obvious signs of radioactivity you will see in a collection, the amount of radium that's actually in these, basically the amount of radiation that you'd be exposed to, is probably maybe a smidge above background radiation that you just kind of get from existing in the world. So you would need a very sensitive Geiger counter to essentially even pick up on it. But radioactive materials, so there's two types of basically radioactive toxicity, chronic radiation syndrome and acute radiation syndrome. So acute radiation syndrome is the one that tends to make the news, since it tends to be the really, really bad exposures, your Chernobyls, your things like that, where you have very immediate effects that are then followed by a latent period, and then you have very catastrophic delayed periods that basically the difference is result in mass cell death. Whereas chronic radiation happens a little bit over a long period of time. A lot of symptoms are kind of more gradual on their onset, and it's kind of considered more cell damage than cell death. But both basically do tend to result in genetic damage, and both tend to increase your likelihood of things like cancer, hair loss, things of that nature, central nervous system impairment, fun things like that. And again, the sort of the intensity of the symptoms depends on doses and also the specific organ systems that are affected. And that kind of tends to be which organ systems are exposed to it. And kind of just sort of takeaways from this is the uranium glass, or as I said before, only kind of slightly above background levels of radiation. So they're cool, they're pretty to look at. I don't know, maybe not, again, drink anything too acidic out of them. But in general speaking, they're usually pretty safe for collections. Radium paint, that which survives to this day, is often survived because it is encased in something, usually something like a watch or a clock face. So that glass does add a barrier that tends to reduce the amount of radiation that you'd be receiving. So generally speaking, things that are encased that use radium paints, for example, tend to be monitored, but otherwise considered safe. It is good to note that radioactive decay, unlike arsenic, doesn't transfer. So just because things that are in close proximity with your radiation at the levels that are present in these artifacts, at least, will not irradiate that material to the point where it itself becomes radioactive. It is not generally strong enough. It's not usually present in enough quantity to sufficiently irradiate the things around it to the point where they become radioactive as well. Radium paint that is not encased, however, is the area where we probably want to be most concerned. And in which case, you want to make sure it's higher risk. You want to make sure that it is carefully contained and documented as to what it contains. And again, there's a lot of, we have a lot of commercially available monitoring systems, Geiger counters, begins with a D, I'm blanking on the word, but they're dosimeters. This is a dosimeter, the things you can actually wear on your person. And honestly, you probably are, in most museums, you are probably at higher risk from being from exposure from radiation from an X-ray machine that you might have site than you tend to be from your radioactive collections. But good, it is still good to know that they're there, that material is there, and that you should still kind of treat them with some amount of caution in terms of how you handle them. And kind of like most other toxic materials we've talked about, the biggest people who are at risk for actual exposure and radiation illness are the people that manufacture these materials. Probably the most well-known case is the case of the radium girls. Between 1917 and 1922, an epidemic of illnesses began to strike young dial painters at various radium painted dial manufacturing sites. Essentially, they would get sick over a long period of time. Then all of a sudden they would develop basically bone cancer. Essentially, their jaws, essentially the mineral content from their bones would be leached, or basically a condition called radium jaw, in which essentially their bones become very weak and brittle and essentially would collapse under their own weight, amongst other things. Their teeth would fall out, they would lose hair, they were becoming increasingly ill. No one really knew what was happening until they made the connection that as part of their jobs, they were actually, part of the process of painting these dials, which are very, very fine, they were being taught that in order to get the fine tip on your paintbrush, in order to paint these very tiny dials, these very tiny numbers on the faces of these clocks, something called lip pointing, where basically you would take your paintbrush, put it in your mouth, and kind of use your lips to basically form a nice, crisp tip. Unfortunately, you were also dipping that tip into radium paint, which was then going back into your mouth. So very shortly after these cases, girls started being sick for almost a decade, and actually started, as a kind of an important part in labor history, they started actually suing the companies. And many of them won basically their liability lawsuits against the companies that they worked for not adequately basically protecting them or informing them about the dangers of the materials they were working with. And actually, unfortunately, many of these girls died before they could actually collect on what they were basically owed in terms of medical bills. But it did lead to the first occupational disease labor laws in the United States, for instance. So that is one good thing that did come out of it. So whenever you see radium glass or radium paints or uranium glass, just think of the radium girls. All right, so flammables and combustibles, sort of the next segment. All right, so the biggie here is cellulose nitrate. So cellulose nitrate is essentially cellulose, so the structural fiber in plants that has been treated with a mixture of nitric and sulfuric acid to produce what is called cellulose nitrate. Cellulose nitrate, early precursors were invented or kind of played around with in the 1830s, but it was really the year 1846, which is a big year in the development of cellulose nitrate. We have two sort of independent discoveries of it. It was first technically discovered by Christian Friedrich Schonbein. However, the credit to the discovery went to F.J. Otter initially because he published first. And to kind of give you a bit of a hint as to the problem with cellulose nitrate, the thing that it was made to make originally was gun cotton, so basically replacement for gunpowder, which basically kind of gives you a clue in that the problem with cellulose nitrate is that it is flammable and very highly combustible. All right, so cellulose nitrate derivatives really took off, and a lot of experimentation produced things like, hey, if we take the cellulose nitrate and we dissolve it into alcohol and ether, we create this nice sort of plastic-like film, which became the first emulsions for early photography, known as collodion. And if we treat it slightly differently, we actually get this kind of cool plastic material, which is the development of celluloid plastics. So the first really early plastics beginning in the mid-19th century. And these still around today. So plastics and also things like photographic materials, so early film rolls and other sort of early celluloid emission-based photography as well. It was briefly used actually as rayon. It was sort of the original rayon. It was used as the first sort of synthetic silk for a very brief period of time in the early 20th century, mostly because it was very flammable, which is not ideal in the stocking. It was later pretty shortly replaced also by other methods like the viscose method, which is still pretty much used today, as well as the Cooper ammonia method, also still in process today, and also was still used as a lacquer, so basically as an adhesive and a coating for various things. All right, so celluloid degradation. So celluloid is not very stable. We're just going to put that right out there. It is very susceptible to various types of degradation, including thermal, so heat degradation, so things that cause it to warp. It is very, very susceptible for photochemical degradation, so basically light energy that contains UV, for instance, causes degradation of the structural integrity of the material, also color changes. Physical, it often becomes very brittle, very fragile over time because of the thermal and photochemical degradation. There's also types of chemical degradation. One of the first that tends to happen is the loss of its plasticizer through sublimation, which is camphor. So yeah, I forgot to say that celluloid is the treatment of cellulose nitrate with camphor, essentially. Camphor is traditionally the major plasticizer. So as this over time, camphor basically exits your celluloid over time. It's lost into the ether, as it were. And as it leaves, suddenly your plastic isn't so plastic anymore, and it becomes increasingly brittle and more subject to physical damage, etc. There's also and as this degradation is happening, what happens is the ignition temperature is reduced. So initially, cellulose nitrate has an ignition temperature of 150 degrees Celsius. That can be very rapidly reduced to only 50 degrees Celsius, which is about 122 degrees Fahrenheit, through these degradation processes, which basically means that a light bulb could theoretically ignite cellulose nitrate. Like that ambient heat from a light bulb might be enough to actually cause self-ignition of this material. Also, what happens as it decays, nitric acid is a very important part of the composition of cellulose nitrate. And as that camphor leaves and the plasticizer leaves, and you're left with this increasingly brittle cellulose nitrate material, that material itself starts to degrade as well. And there's an increase in the concentration of nitrogen gases that form, which themselves are very corrosive gases. So then creates this kind of vicious feedback loop of decay, creating nitrogen gases, those nitrogen gases themselves then causing more decay of the material. So it really expedites the decay of the material, also can contribute to its flammability. And as this material starts to break down into smaller particles, it actually creates this dust that itself can spontaneously combust. And this is rather well known in the film industry because the original type of film that was used in the film industry was cellulose nitrate-based tape. Unfortunately, some very high-profile explosions and fires at warehouses in the early 20th century, one of the most well-known being the Lubin Manufacturing Company in 1914 in Philadelphia, in which they lost their entire film catalog, basically pre-1914, in one fell swoop due to a massive multiple fires and explosions at their warehouse due to the degradation of their cellulose nitrate film. Another well-known one occurred at MGM theaters in the 1950s. So it's one of the reasons that we've lost so much of the history of our early film here in the United States, is that so much of this early film was so unstable that it basically self-immolated in storage, and that is why we don't have so many of sort of the great classics of the silent film era, for example. Also in the 1950s is when they started to thankfully phase out cellulose nitrate and replace it with first cellulose acetate, which is much more stable, and then eventually polyester and PET-based films in the beginning of the 1980s. And now everything's digital. So where are they? So where is cellulose nitrate in my collection? Because it doesn't seem super obvious necessarily. Well, types of celluloid-based materials. We have all types of accessories. Celluloid was really popular in things like hair combs and brushes and mirrors, and because you could do a lot of cool things with it. It could simulate ivory. It had a really cool texture to it, a really cool surface. It was easy to dye, easy to color. So you could actually create a lot of sort of faux textures and presentations. So for instance, this is faux ivory. You here in this clock, decorative accessories. You have faux tortoiseshell, faux mother of pearl, and faux sort of either ivory or marble on this clock here. So these were kind of really ways to basically replace expensive, rare materials with things that were a lot easier to produce and kind of make it look like it was a lot fancier and more expensive than it was. So these are very popular items, beginning kind of in the 1870s, really, and then sort of carrying in, especially through mid-century America before they start getting replaced by other types of plastics. But we still do have celluloid in use today as well. Again, you might find some early rayon. You might find cellulose nitrate or celluloid-based buttons. These are actually from the 1980s. And also you have a horrifying selection of recreation things like billiard balls, tennis balls, and horrifying children's toys like these really, really creepy dolls that are also heavily flammable, so definitely give them to children. And then, of course, if you have any sort of sizable film or archival film collection that has things like X-rays, any types of photographic materials like negatives, or some of that cellulose nitrate-based video film, these are always going to be probably the most sensitive things in any collection when it comes to the degradation of cellulose nitrate, and probably the most likely things to, if you're going to have a flammable incident, these are probably going to be it. X-rays, they started phasing the cellulose nitrate out of X-rays in like the 1930s, and as I mentioned before, a lot of cellulose nitrate-based other film material started being phased out in the 1950s, as soon as other replacements became available. All right, so again, biggest clue in terms of how do I know if I have these types of materials in my collection: time period. If there's any, there was only one type of clear transparent plastic-like material pre-1920. So if you have a clear transparent plastic-like material that is before the 1920s, it is most likely a cellulose nitrate-based material. Sometimes there are manufacturers, especially when it comes to films, that do us handy things like putting edge markings that will tell you it is made of cellulose nitrate. But again, context is everything when determining what these materials are made of and where they came from. However, there are kind of a bigger stable of testing options. There's the diphenylamine chemical spot test. Basically, it's a color change test to test for, it's a destructive test where you take a small sample. You need less than 1 millimeter generally, and you expose it to a solution of diphenylamine dissolved in sulfuric acid. And basically, if you have cellulose nitrate, it'll have this very clear blue-violet stain that forms. So it'll have a color change that happens. It's pretty obvious. There's a polarization test, which you can actually DIY it pretty easily. There's instructions online. You can find polarized filters pretty easily in sort of science kits, sometimes craft stores, things like that. And basically what it is that if you look at an artifact that you suspect might be cellulose nitrate between two cross-polarized filters, you can see if it has what we call interference colors. If it has interference colors, it is not cellulose nitrate. If it does not have interference colors, it is. So interference colors, just for an example, they're that kind of rainbow haze that you see bubbles and things like that. Those are considered interference colors. So particularly things in the red and green spectrum will not have. There's the burn test. Don't really recommend this one for obvious reasons. But you can take a small bit of your cellulose nitrate object and burn it. It will produce a very quick ignition and a very yellow distinctive flame. Again, don't really recommend this one. There's kind of a low rent version of this where you can kind of take it take an object and put it under hot water, or even rub it, and that friction might produce enough heat to produce what we, the scent of camphor is how it's described. I can say I've never been successful in this, so I don't actually know. It's oft talked about in collector forums, but I don't really think it really works all that well. Also, please don't put your artifacts under hot water if you can help it for most instances as well. And lastly, there's the float test, which uses trichloroethylene solution, which is carcinogenic, so please don't use this unless you're under guidance from someone who knows what they're doing. And basically, the float test essentially separates different types of cellulose materials by weight. Cellulose nitrate is the heaviest, so it'll sink to the bottom. And then you can always tell that you have cellulose nitrates by the signs and symptoms of deterioration of the collection. It has some very distinct forms of deterioration, including yellowing, optical changes from that photochemical reactions, embrittlement, shrinkage. You might get the formation of bubbles or foam. And then there's that deterioration into a foamy or powdery mass, which is the self-igniting type. This is bad. Don't let it get this bad. And oftentimes people describe an acidic or vinegar-like smell in association with their cellulose nitrate-based collections. All right, so even though cellulose nitrate is really flammable, under most normal museum conditions, your cellulose nitrate materials will probably not spontaneously combust. This because this is due to nitrogen content. The higher nitrogen content you have in your cellulose nitrate, the more likely it is to go boom. And the threshold is essentially 13%. And as you can see, most things that we just talked about that are actually in your museum collection do not fall into that parameter. They may be highly flammable, especially anything over 12%, but they will probably not explode the way that, say, gun cotton is, unless you have gun cotton in your collection, which please don't have gun cotton in your collection. So the best things you can do is to store and display your cellulose separately from the rest of your collection. This is to minimize basically contact with any type of corrosive nitrogen gases that are released during the decay of cellulose nitrate. Unfortunately, cellulose nitrate is sort of on an inevitable path of decay. We can slow it down, but we can't stop it. So the best thing we can do is try to insulate other sensitive materials, things like metals or other types of organic materials that might be affected by those nitrogen gases, by trying to segregate it in something that is fireproof if possible. The other best thing we can do is to try to delay decay by maintaining good storage conditions. A key to this is good ventilation. So regardless of where you store it, please make sure that it has some sort of air exchange so that those nitrogen gases are not building up and collecting in one place and accelerating the deterioration of your collection or increasing the likelihood that things might go boom. Reduce light and UV exposure. Recommendations tend to be below 50 lux. Also reduce relative humidity and temperature. So recommendations for relative humidity, so like 40 to 50% will help reduce a lot of chemical degradation of your collection. And also temperatures at or below 10 degrees Celsius will definitely slow down the deterioration of your collection a lot, which is why a lot of times when it has cellulose nitrate-based films or negatives, for instance, we are often recommended cold storage, so refrigeration storage, essentially, as long as your refrigerator also has humidity control, because cold and humid is not good any more than dry and hot, unfortunately. Monitor frequently, so these are things that you should be, looking at fairly frequently, checking on to see, how slow down if there's any new degradation, if it's sped up, if it's slowed down. These should be things that you regularly check for new deterioration. And it goes, if in the worst case scenario and these materials pose too much of a hazard to be in your collection, or else they have deteriorated to the point where they're no longer useful to your collection, please make sure you document them clearly and also dispose of them in accordance with your state and local guidelines. And also, keep away from sources of ignition. So do not expose to temperatures that are above 50 degrees Celsius, just as a precaution. Other thing, so last one I promised, last bonus material, black powder ammunition. So black powder ammunition is composed of carbon, sulfur, and treated with potassium nitrate, also known as saltpeter, to form a very combustible substance. It is the earliest chemical explosive. First records of it date back to 9th century China. It is used both as propellant in firearms, artillery, and pyrotechnics. as well as a blasting agent in quarrying and mining, etc. Although because it is a low explosive, it's not as effective as things like TNT, but it is still used quite commonly in those applications. It is used because it burns quickly, because that high carbon content. It is also really easy to ignite. You can ignite it using a flame or a spark. It ignites spontaneously at temperatures above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and also things like friction, impact, static electricity can all set off your gunpowder, which is why these are an issue in collections. And it says pre-1890s here, just because 1890s is kind of considered the cutoff for when black powder was really kind of heavily in use. This was when things like cellulose nitrate started to kind of supersede black powder, gunpowder as propellants and blasting agents, as well as things like smokeless gunpowder, which was a different formula of gunpowder that basically made it less sensitive, we'll just say. So it was not as likely to go boom if you dropped it. And what they look like in collections. So this is actually an example from something that is in storage in our Hazardous collection. So this is a cannonball that would have been filled with black powder. It would have been an exploding cannonball. It would have been filled with black powder and sort of created its own little shrapnel field as it exploded. This one obviously was not. This was conserved way before my time, so I don't really know what was done with it, but presumably this came from an archaeological maritime context. It was something that came from or near the ocean, and it was also unloaded, or the gunpowder is removed from it at some point in its history, which has basically rendered it inert. This is another artifact currently in Hatteras. It is a box of 50 caliber ammunition from the USS Huron, which sank in 1877. So this is presumably pre-1877 manufacture, so it's just a box full of unexploded ordnance, which is great. But again, from an archaeological context, so this was sitting in salt water for 100+ years. Water has that pesky property of sort of making gunpowder not go boom. So the fact that it was in salt water probably has reduced its ability to explode on us, so that was always good. But this is a later project. This is a more recent project that I actually did work on. This is an example of a small firearm. This is a British Care revolver from around circa the American Civil War. And it actually came to us loaded from our Southport site. So inside of it, the chamber, there were 3 rounds and gunpowder. So what we did with this is that I consulted with someone who's been trained how to deal with black powder materials, and together we unloaded it. So we removed the bullets, and then we basically used water to flush out the gunpowder. And then got it nice and, so which basically rendered it inert and less likely to accidentally go boom on us. It also didn't help that this is, or actually probably did help for us at least, that this was probably kept in someone's attic for probably 50 some odd years and probably exposed to the wonderful humidity of North Carolina summer. So again, water tends to render gunpowder inert for the most part. We actually did test this to see if it would still combust. It didn't even spark. So yes, I think between the humidity and our technique that we used to get it out, we pretty much rendered it inert. So, all right. So what to do with black powder in your collection? So again, keep separate, put it in a fireproof area if possible. Make sure to document and label correctly so people know what it is and don't just sort of chuck it into a bin. Keep away from sources of ignition, very important. And also, if possible, please try to unload any small firearms or artillery that are in your collection using the guidance of an experienced museum professional, or if worse comes to worse, contact the Department of Defense, the Marine Corps, the Explosive Ordnance Disposal EOD unit, which is part of the Marine Corps, or sometimes you might even have some sort of public bomb safety squad in your local area that you can contact and work with them to try to disarm these materials, make them inert, or worst comes to worst, safely dispose of them, meaning detonate them in a controlled environment. So conclusions. So thank you very much for hanging on with me this long. We are finally at the end. But conclusions. So I guess what I want you to take away from this talk is that most hazards, the materials in your collections, they might sound really scary. And I know I've talked about some really scary things about the worst case scenarios for exposures to some of the materials that are contaminating or comprising our materials in our collections. But most of them probably pose a pretty low risk to you as an individual. The vast majority of the danger probably occurred during their time of manufacture or initial application, but it is good still to practice caution. Historical context is probably as important, if not more important, a tool in terms of trying to determine what you have on hand in terms of trying to identify hazardous materials than any type of chemical or spectral testing, even though they are important. In general, when in doubt, if you have any type of suspicion that a material might be hazardous to your health, just treat it as such. Like, better safe than sorry, as it were. And then, again, minimize contact or exposure where possible. Wear your PPE and keep sources away from, keep materials away from sources of ignition, catalysts, from things that might speed up their degradation, and thus sort of increase the risk that those contaminants or those toxic materials, hazardous materials, might end up in you. Isolate hazardous or contaminant possibles where possible. Delay decay, so practice good storage environment that slows degradation. Practice good documentation and labeling so that you can properly communicate to other people the potential risk involved with your collection, especially if people, as things turn over, people lose jobs, people lose institutional knowledge. It is really important to remember to document what you have so that you know that there's a big box of unexploded ordnance sitting in your collection. And also dispose of hazardous materials if necessary, using the proper guidance from the correct authorities, either local, state, federal, etc., depending on your proposed jurisdiction. And most importantly, please don't lick the artifacts. So thank you very much for your time. If you like this presentation, please return to Fort Macon again November 6th. If you want to listen to my colleague, our natural science curator, Keith Thriftmaster, give his talks on the whales of North Carolina, which is something completely different. So thank you for bearing with me. Anyone have any questions? Okay. Very interesting. Thank you. So yeah, any questions, suggestions, other information? Yeah. I love that artifact. It's my favorite artifact. No. Do you know of any people that have ever gotten from their collection? Not personally, no. At least not in modern times. Collections managers tell each other as a collections manager. I mean, the closest is probably the unfortunate story about Madame Curie. In terms of her own discoveries and collections contributed probably to her death, most likely. So. Yes. Also she is very radioactive. She was buried in lead. I will not forget my